Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. We're super excited to have Dr. Michael Grandner here talking with us about sleep and the brain and what's going on while we're sleeping. So let me give a brief introduction of Dr. Grandner, and then I will turn it over to him. I know he has a lot of great information to share. Dr. Grandner is the director of the Sleep and Health Research Program at the University of Arizona. He's also the director of the Behavioral Sleep Medicine Clinic at the Banner University Medical Center. In addition, he's an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Arizona College of Medicine, with joint appointments in nutritional sciences, medicine, psychology, and clinical translational science, as well as a faculty member of the neuroscience and physiological science graduate interdisciplinary programs. So quite busy, really impressive. We always love to talk to Dr. Grandner. He has so much information. His current research focuses on how sleep is related to health, in particular health issues such as neurocognitive function, mental health, longevity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity. So just really a full spectrum of health issues. He has over 175 publications, over 8,000 citations. His research has been funded by prestigious institutions such as the NIDA, the NIMHD, the NCAA, and the American Heart Association, to name a few. So he is just a fantastic speaker, very passionate and knowledgeable, and we're so happy to have him with us today. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Grandner, and I'll go ahead and mute myself and turn my video off. He's going to speak to us, like I said, about the brain and sleep, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So if you have questions, just go ahead and enter them in the Q&A session, and we'll take those, as many as we can, at the end. Thanks, Dr. Grandner.
All right, thank you. And thanks for that awesome introduction. I'm really excited to share some of this with you today. I'm going to go through a few slides pretty quickly, giving a pretty quick overview of some of these concepts, and then take some time for questions. So first of all, a little bit about sleep in the brain. Why is sleep so connected to the brain? Well, there are three systems in the brain that are important to sleep. First, there's the sleep active system. This is the system that initiates sleep and drives sleep. It's mostly driven by GABA here in the hypothalamus, and mostly involves structures in the midbrain and brainstem. Then you also have the wake system, which is separate from the sleep system. This also originates down in the brainstem and midbrain and projects up into the cortex, but mostly involves structures down here. So these are two separate systems, controlling sleep and controlling wake. This maintains wakefulness during the day, and this takes over with sleep at night. The third system is the circadian system. This involves the eye actually sending light to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, which then also involves the pineal gland where melatonin gets secreted. And this sends the nighttime signal to the body. So all three of these systems in the brain play really important roles in sleep health. And one thing you can see on here is not only do they relate to lots of different functions, but there's lots of different mechanisms involved in sleep health. You have lots of different neurotransmitter and other systems. So a little bit about sleep and memory and forgetting. So sleep plays important roles in procedural learning and motor learning, in emotional memory, and especially memory consolidation. It seems like what sleep does is you take information from your experiences during the day, and when you're asleep, you consolidate that information, sort it through, organize it, and solidify it in the ways that you need to, or get rid of it if you don't. So sleep might also be for forgetting, in terms of pruning experiences and relationships. There's a whole literature here on sort of the basic science of functions of sleep in terms of synaptic homeostasis and maintaining optimal memory functions. Another important function of sleep that has to do with the brain is waste clearance. So this is work led by Megan Niedergaard and others on this idea of the glymphatic system, where one of the ways that the brain releases toxins and waste products is during sleep. Actually, you have the interstitial space between cells increasing allowing for the release of certain substances, especially things like beta amyloid, which can lead to Alzheimer's disease. So sleep plays important roles in waste clearance from the brain. This might be why that sleep seems to play important roles in brain health as people age. So here's a study that followed people across 10 years, and they looked to see, and they looked at cognitive decline across a bunch of different functions. And what you can see is that, that the change in cognitive decline is mirrored by the severity of change in insomnia symptoms, whether it's overall cognitive function, in terms of, so here is difficulty initiating sleep. As that gets worse, overall cognitive function decreases, but also here, this is nocturnal awakenings, and here's early morning awakenings and waking feeling unrested. So you can see that there's this gradient to how cognition declines relative to sleep. Here's another study that looked at hippocampal volume. So the hippocampus in the brain plays really important roles in terms of memory function. It's sort of seen as the important brain organelle in terms of, or brain system in terms of memory. What you could see is when you track people over 5 years, the red line are the people with sleep problems. You could see decreases in volume across the age spectrum in people who aren't sleeping well. So sleep plays really important roles in terms of the health of the brain and its function in general. How does this impact performance? Sleep impacts performance in a number of important ways. Here's some data from a very famous study by Van Dongen and colleagues. What they did was they had people in the lab for 2 weeks. So here's 14 nights in the lab. They had either 8, 6, or 4 hours time in bed. And you to see, look at their PVT performance lapses. PVT is a measure of focus and attention and ability to maintain attention. And lapses are bad. They're when you can't maintain attention and focus, and sort of where you wink out. And what you can see here is the 8-hour time in bed group stayed pretty much the same across 2 weeks in the lab. But the less sleep people got, the more impaired they were during the day. They weren't able to focus and maintain attention. Interestingly, though, the effects were cumulative. People got worse and worse and worse and worse. And the rate at which they got worse depended on how little sleep they got. So if you got less sleep, you got worse faster. It also means in the first day or two, people were still doing relatively okay, but they just got worse and worse over time. But what's interesting is after 2 weeks, there was no adjustment. But if you ask people how they're doing, these are the subjective data, people don't realize they're getting worse. They know they're not as good as the 8-hour time in bed group. They know that their subjective reports are somewhat impaired, but they think they're leveling off. And I think anyone on here can attest to that. They know of people who've sort of gone on less sleep for a while and they think their body is adjusting. But the truth is it's not. They think they're adjusting, but they're getting worse and more impaired over time. So how does this translate into the real world? Sleep deprivation leads to poor decision-making. There are some great studies on this, a lot of them funded by the Department of Defense, basically showing that sleep-deprived people make poor decisions. They have an inability to process complex data streams. They have an impaired ability to weigh risks and benefits. It's not that they're riskier, it's that they have a harder time telling how risky something is. And this seems to be partially driven by impaired ability to discern good information from bad information, where, so an example of this is how long I should keep going on this slide has to do with how much time I've got left, how much I'm rambling, how much more I have left to do. Those are all important pieces of information. Unimportant piece of information is what color is the slide, what did I have for breakfast this morning, etc. Those are things that are bad pieces of information to use in making a decision of how long to go on with the story. The more sleep deprived you are, it seems to impair your ability to weigh these pieces of information to come to an optimal conclusion. That's why systematically people who are sleep deprived make bad choices, even if they don't know why. They also have decreased ability to make long-term decisions because you're much more focused in the here and now. And this isn't fixed with stimulants. There's a number of studies now showing that if you impair cognitive function with sleep loss, with stimulants, you can reduce reaction time, you can reduce fatigue, you can improve focus and attention, but you can't improve decision-making and other complex tasks with stimulants, even there's no caffeine or amphetamines in the world that seem to be able to do it. There have been a number of studies looking at this. Here's a real world example. We looked at drowsy driving, and we showed that you could see here that the people who are getting, compared to people getting 7 or 8 hours, people who are getting 5 or 6 hours are more likely to be nodding off at the wheel. They were about twice as likely if they were 6-hour sleepers, and about 3.5 to 4 times as likely if they were at 5 or fewer hour sleepers. Then we only looked at people who said they were 100% fully rested. They didn't get enough. They got plenty of sleep for the last 30 days. 0 nights of the last 30 days, they got insufficient sleep. They would never get insufficient sleep. So then what we showed here is the amount of sleep you got is what predicts drowsy driving, not how well rested you think you are. If you're getting 5 or 6 hours and you think you are totally well rested, you are still impaired when it comes to drowsy driving. So not getting enough healthy sleep is a important driver of daytime performance, even if you don't notice. This impacts work performance. So here's some data from Mark Rosekind and colleagues showing that in a typical good sleeper, the cost of lost productivity was approximately $1,300 per employee per year. In those with insomnia, that was more than double. In those who didn't have insomnia but just weren't getting enough sleep, again, it was also more than double. And in people who were at risk, so these are people who didn't even have insomnia and were sort of on the border of whether or not they were getting enough sleep. They weren't really clearly over the line. Even still, they were losing 80% more productivity than somebody who was well rested. And when they looked to see where that productivity loss came from, it came from a combination of things. So they had more problems with time management. This is key. A lot of people sleep less because it thinks that makes them more productive. It's the opposite. They're less able to manage time, demands, and the job. They're less productive. They're less efficient, and they get done and they do less, even if they're sleeping less. Here's another example. So this was a cool study in semi-pro tennis players where they got 5 hours of sleep versus their normal 8-ish hours of sleep. And so they had to hit this, they were tennis semi-pros, they were serving. So they had to hit this target. Their serving accuracy decreased 31% in the sleep restricted condition. And it was still reduced by 19% when they got caffeine. So the idea was, can you caffeinate this away? You could caffeinate part of it, but still, instead of a 30% decrement in performance, it was still a 20% decrement in performance. It shows like, this is just one of those studies, you can't caffeinate this away. In terms of perceived cognitive decline, so here's some nationally representative data. We looked at a few 100,000 US adults, looked at how many hours of sleep they got and how likely were they to say that their cognition is worse than it was a year ago. And you can see this U-shaped relationship in both men and women, that people who are sleeping less and also people getting like 9, 10 or more hours of sleep are also reporting more perceived cognitive decline. And we can talk about long sleepers in a little bit. But this is a more rare group. It's more likely you have these short sleepers. And what you can see is this age gradient, where if you're 70 and 80 and you're perceiving some cognitive decline and you're not sleeping enough, the sleep might be contributing. But if you're in your 40s and 50s and you're experiencing cognitive decline, that's not normal. Like, what's going on? Are you just not sleeping? Especially if you're in your 40s. And people who are older, so one thing that's paradoxical here is they might actually be a little more resilient to sleep loss as people get older. So here's one of my favorite studies, sleep deprivation in the lab. And they rated their alertness. They came in about the same. When they asked people how they did, they both rated about 25% decrease in their relative performance. When you split people into young and older, the older people actually overestimated how impaired they were. They were actually only impaired about 15% instead of 25%, which they thought. The young people, though, dramatically underestimated how impaired they were, where their performance reduced by 70%. They only thought it was a 25% decrement. So this just goes to show that people still felt impaired, but how impaired you felt didn't correlate with how impaired you actually were. So I think this is important, and that there is this age issue that as people get older, they might actually be a little more resilient. So thank you for your attention, for your time. I know I went through a lot of stuff really fast, but hopefully the message came across that sleep is driven by lots of different brain functions, and many brain functions play a role. Sleep plays many protective functions for the brain in terms of preventing dementia risk and for promoting cognition during the day. And that age plays a role in this too, in a potentially complicated way. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing now. And
hold on, before
open
you
for
stop
questions.
sharing,
Okay.
Dr. Grandner. Actually,
Okay.
we have a lot of questions that have come in, but I would love to go back to that slide on the hippocampal volume. I thought that was so fascinating. You know, a lot of times I think people think of sleep issues and they think of maybe an older demographic, but this is just, you know, shocking actually. So can you explain like what's going on in the 20-year-old group there? What are we actually seeing?
Yeah, so I'd have to pull up the paper to refresh myself on the exact details, but this was a larger study. I think it was based in Europe, where they gathered imaging data on large numbers of people, and they looked at, and they just tracked hippocampal volume across 5 years, and they asked people a just broad sleep question, and they wanted to see was this difference in sleep at baseline, did it predict a different trajectory? And the hypothesis was it would, for a number of reasons. First of all, sleep could be a marker of underlying brain dysfunction. Like, you know, it could be a canary in the coal mine that something's wrong. That's frequently the case. It could also be a driver of problems, where when you're not sleeping well, it leads you. So imagine if you're chronically sleep deprived, you're not able to pay as good attention to things out in the world. You have trouble with memory. You have trouble with decision making. And this goes on for years and years and years. So what you're getting more, it could reduce your brain's ability to actually perform those functions because it's been impaired for so long. It's sort of like, you know, when you break your leg and then you don't walk on it for months while it's healing, that leg becomes very weak and you have to work it back up again. And so this could basically be an indication that when people aren't sleeping well, it sets them up for all these problems later. And it doesn't matter how old you are. Even the 80-year-olds who are getting getting volume loss anyway, it was faster when they weren't sleeping.
Exactly. And I mean, we don't think of hippocampal volume loss in those younger demographics, 20 and 40. And it looks like this also really aligns with what you're saying, because their self-report of whether they're tired or not doesn't seem to have such an impact. But when you look at maybe more about their performance and problems, then huge drop in hippocampal volume loss, you know, maybe even due to neurogenesis rates that would possibly be happening at night.
I mean, so I'm working with a colleague right now looking at neurogenicity related to sleep and dementia. I mean, that seems to be like I think that is part of the story. I just think it goes to show that, unfortunately, it used to be the case that when people said, "Am I getting enough sleep?" Well, I'm not sure. How do you feel? I feel fine. Well, then you're probably okay. All the data points to like, I actually don't care how you feel. We should look for objective measures, because we don't have a blood test for how much sleep you need, but clearly, so there are a lot of people not getting the healthy sleep that they need.
Mm-hmm. All right. So like I said, we have a lot of questions coming in. So let's get to them. And if you want, you feel free to stop sharing the slides. I won't try and go back.
Okay.
Throw you for a loop there. One question is very related to what we just talked about, but on the underlying mechanisms of action. So especially if we're looking for instance for an ingredient that could help with sleep health, what would be some of those underlying mechanisms that might be important to benefit?
Yeah, that's a great question, because when people think of sleep-related mechanisms of action, they only think sedation, which is usually GABAergic. And for good reason. Sleeping pills are GABAergic, anxiety meds are GABAergic, and they make you sleepy. And if sleep is the thing you're searching for, this will help get you there. But similarly, alcohol is probably the most used sleep drug in the world, and it's GABAergic, but it makes sleep worse. Like it gets you to sleep faster, but the sleep you get is worse, and it causes more problems than it fixes. And a lot of GABAergic ingredients and drugs can sometimes backfire. Sometimes they can. Sometimes it's just that little push people need, and sometimes it's very appropriate. But oftentimes it ends up backfiring. There's a reason why any kind of sleep supplement or drug that has sedation as its primary mechanism of action, the number one complaint that people have about it and side effect is daytime sedation, grogginess, drowsiness, memory problems, difficulty focusing, which gets people worried about things like safety and brain health and all these other things. So like if they're taking it to sleep better, to perform better, and it gets them to sleep, but it doesn't actually fix the daytime problem and makes it worse, then it's sort of backfiring. But then people feel like they don't have anywhere else to turn. So what I would argue for is that we should be exploring other mechanisms of action for sleep. Remember that slide before had all kinds of other neurotransmitter systems are involved in sleep-wake regulation. So there are lots of pathways in. For example, in terms of prescription drugs, like the newest class of insomnia medications that seem to be working quite well have nothing to do with sleep onset. They have or promoting sleep so much as they do it at suppressing orexin, which reduces the wake drive. So that there's lots of different mechanisms in. So if you had something that was serotonergic or cholinergic or noradrenergic, they could all be playing roles in sleep, whether it's during the day or at night. Also, if you go through, because sleep is so intimately tied with sort of immune system and regeneration, if you could somehow promote cellular recovery and repair, antioxidant status, promote immune health or anti-inflammatory health, like that would probably help with sleep too, especially people who have some fragmented sleep because their immune system is dealing with some of these issues.
Awesome. So, and that kind of rolls into the second question we had, which is looking at sedation, if sedation really is the best way for long-term sleep ingredient aid or not, or
I mean, I don't know about the best. For some people, it's probably super helpful because what they need is they need a little push to get going. And if for those people, sedation is probably super helpful. But a lot of people, so first of all, a lot of people need something different than that. And if you need a big push, then maybe you need to see a doctor if it's a clinical condition, if it's more than a little push. But there's so much more to sleep than that. Just getting you into sleep is just step one. So I really am excited about people in the industry who are looking at, well, sleep is it's the bottom of the oceans. It's very varied landscape. We think it's not this flat blue thing that we see. There's all this stuff going on under the surface and lots of opportunities to make that better. And so if sleep is performing all these important roles, how can we supplement that? How do we help it do the job that it's doing? And sedation isn't going to do it. That'll help get you under the water, but it won't do anything won't do much once you're there. Once you're there, there's all kinds of other opportunities though.
I love that analogy. That is awesome. Yeah. And so we have another question, I think related to that, is about how to recover from a poor night's sleep. So, you talked about how night after night, it is accumulative. And so, people are wanting to know, what are we to do in order to recover if we have a poor night of sleep?
Yeah. I mean, the answer to that, for good or for bad, like, the good and bad news is it's not like a bank account where every dollar you spend, you have to pay back. It's easier, but it's also harder. In truth, it's more like diet. It's more like, when people say, how much sleep do I need on the weekend to make up for not getting enough sleep during the week? To me, that's like saying, how much kale do I need to eat on the weekend to make up for eating nothing but pizza and cheeseburgers during the week?
That doesn't work?
I wish it did. I do wish it did. But it's certainly better, and it's certainly changing things up a little bit, but it's not, there's no amount of salad you can eat on the weekend that will undo that. It's about achieving balance. Sleep is about balance. Our lives are very often out of balance, but so if someone has a rough night of sleep, if someone sleeps generally okay and they have a couple nights of really rough sleep because they're stressed out, the correct answer of what to do is nothing. Nothing. Just keep your regular schedule. Like if you hit you guys are in Iowa, I'm in Arizona, but I'm from the Northeast, from a snowy place. If you hit an icy patch on the road, don't overcorrect. You're going to end up in the ditch. You keep your wheels forward.
Yeah.
That's the same way with diet too. Like if you have a generally good diet and then you have one day where you're out somewhere and you're eating and you eat something unhealthy for a day, like you don't then have to fast for a couple days to make up for it. You just eat your regular diet and your body will sort itself out in time.
I love that. That's
Balance,
nice.
balance.
So keep
Yeah.
trying to be as healthy with your sleep.
Don't try and overcompensate because you'll end up in the ditch. People do that with sleep all the time. It's like, then they try and oversleep, and then their body can't do it. And then they're stuck in bed awake all this time. And then they're stressed out, and then they can't sleep more. And it becomes a
vicious cycle. It's a vicious cycle. Now,
okay, what do we got next?
Yeah. All right. We got a question about melatonin. Where does melatonin fit into this?
Yeah. So melatonin is great in that it's probably the most studied compound sold as a supplement in the U.S. There's tons of data on it, on how it works. Your body secretes it at night to tell your body it's nighttime, and as a supplement, it helps promote that nighttime signal. People with insomnia, it often doesn't work because their body already knows it's nighttime. They still can't sleep. That's why a lot of people take it when they have insomnia. It doesn't work. But it's a supplement. It's not supposed to treat insomnia. It's supposed to help support healthy sleep. And that it can do by boosting that nighttime signal. It can maybe help you fall asleep a little faster. And it can help you have healthy sleep during the night. It actually can do all these things. It also could potentially be a powerful antioxidant too. Like melatonin is a good thing. It's not a sedative. And the cool thing is, I've talked about all these other potential mechanisms. They likely don't even interact with melatonin, so they could potentially even be additive, because if melatonin is working on this circadian clock function, and these others are working through sleep-wake regulation, they could be synergistic even. So yeah, I think melatonin could be a great tool in the armamentarium. I just don't think it's the answer to all sleep issues. Nice.
And while we're on the ingredient topic, we did just have a question come in about the green tea polyphenols. And we know they're in the dailyzz, but just polyphenols in general. We know the green tea has EGCG and some other molecules in there. Kind of how are those interacting with sleep? How are polyphenols in general helpful for sleep?
So there's not a ton of data on this mechanistically. My understanding is that there's some preclinical and some clinical data on these in terms of they may have anti-inflammatory properties. I don't think they're sedative. I also don't think that they're insomnogenic or would get in the way of sleep either. But if anything, that might help facilitate some of the recovery elements of sleep potentially. But yeah, no, I mean, it would be great if there were if we could get more clinical data on those. It's just that there's not a lot out there. Sure. I mean, in our study, we showed that at least the combination did something that was beneficial. But I don't think there's a lot, particularly on that mechanism in sleep, to be honest.
Yep, and that's the proof's in the pudding, I guess, with the clinical trials. And I do think we're planning to have a talk. That's a whole nother session on clinical trials and sleep and what we have going there. There's another question here about just sleep quality, and this might be a big question, but how is it measured? How is it evaluated? How do you know if you're getting good sleep? And kind of rolling a couple questions into one. Can everyone get good sleep quality, or can some people just not get good sleep? Or
so first of all, sleep quality is sort of an umbrella term. So for how did you sleep? So sleep quality could be measured as just ask people how they slept, and as a perceived experience. And there's actually a benefit in that, because we don't have the technology to measure all this stuff deep down, because a lot of the stuff that's happening in sleep is deep down in the brain and in the body. And we don't quite have the technology to measure that. We can measure stuff that's going on the outside. We can measure stuff at the wrist, but not a whole lot else. So actually asking people how they slept can actually pick up elements of sleep that we couldn't measure another way. So usually for sleep quality, the gold standard is actually asking. And if you want to be more sophisticated about it, you'd parse it into elements like, all right, how is the process of falling asleep? How is the process of awakening? How long were you up during the night? Were you struggling? Was your sleep fragmented? So there are elements of sleep that you can parse it out into to be a little more sophisticated. But actually, if you can ask someone every morning, sort of, how did you sleep last night, and track that over time, that actually can give you a pretty good barometer of whether or not something's up. Even if maybe they're getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep, they're falling asleep in 15 minutes, but and they're awake for 10 minutes during the night, and they wake up, but they wake up and they feel like something's wrong. Something's probably wrong. Maybe they have undiagnosed sleep apnea or something, or maybe there's an autoimmune something going on that's keeping their sleep a little shallow that these other measures just can't pick up. And often we find something when people have that. So it's actually a simple but shockingly good barometer.
Nice.
Until we get better technology.
Right. And maybe also then looking at how they're actually doing during the day objectively.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that's what the data really showed, that that saying, do you feel rested, does not correlate with performance. Like performance has to do with how sleep deprived you are. And if you're sleep deprived, you may or may not actually know it. So like the first question is, how are you doing? But then if people say I'm doing fine, but their sleep looks like there should be something wrong, like look to something objective, whether it's processing speed or efficiency. And if they've been doing it for a while, they might not even notice this may be their normal. They just don't know how impaired they are.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, as I expected, we have run out of time, and you have so much information to share, such great knowledge. And there was quite a few questions we didn't get to. So if someone asked a question we didn't get to it, we will follow up with that.
Yeah.
And we do have some additional talks coming up, which I'm super excited about. So thank you for being with us today, Dr. Grandner. We really appreciate it. Feel like this is such an important topic. So thanks for sharing your knowledge and passion with us.
No, thank you. If I can help people get better sleep and think about sleep, I think this is awesome.
Yep, awesome.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.